Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I am your host, Leah Troscianecki, and I am joined today by a very good friend of mine, Aaron Murphy. He is a field CTO here in the Americas with me. Aaron, thank you so much for finally getting on the show with me.
Thanks, Leah. It's really good to be on the show. I watched them. You're a professional at this. So everyone, I'm the field CTO for the Americas. I'm here in New Jersey. I've been in the US 10 years, originally from the UK.
Awesome. Well, we are super excited to have you. And this is definitely a show that Aaron and I have been waiting for. It's long in the making. We are so excited to talk about our data resilience maturity model. If you guys, signed up for the show and took a look at our title and abstract, hopefully that gave you guys a sense of how important it is for us to, as a community, really raise up the bar on what it looks like to make our organizations more resilient in the face of any kind of disruption or outage. I don't need to tell you guys all of those different use cases and examples. We talk about them on the show all the time. And frankly, we talk about things like best practices, and the Tech Bytes show covers all these great features that you can use from the Veeam platforms. But today, what we're really excited about is to put some structure around those conversations. And that's really the theme I want everybody to think about. This is a maturity model. A lot of you all have seen maturity models in market before. But unlike other maturity models, we were most excited about this because I think this is one of the best done models I've ever seen, if I'm going to be so bold. And that's because we really took a data-driven approach. And frankly, we reported the news. This isn't going to be something that is all aligned to Veeam solutions or any other vendor solutions. This was really a measured approach to looking at what best practices ultimately lead to better outcomes. And that's a lot of what we're going to focus on in today's show. But before I do that, I'd love to go ahead and do a poll question, because as you guys know, one of the great things about this live stream format is that we can engage with you all in the audience. If you guys are watching the show in the future, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button for Veeam on any of those platforms so that you guys can join us live. I think we're a great lunchtime show for those on the East Coast. Might be an afternoon or evening drink show for you guys in EMEA. I know production mentioned that we have some folks saying hi from Hungary and Turkey. I'm actually going to be visiting you all in Turkey in just a couple of months in Istanbul, and I cannot wait because I've never been. But speaking of places that we've never been, lots of fantastical places. Since today's theme is all about maturity, I figured we would take it back to the start. And I wanted to ask everyone what their favorite movie was as a kid growing up. Were you a big Disney fan? Did you watch a lot of cartoons? I know here in America, when I was growing up, we had those Saturday morning cartoons that were super fun to watch. For me and my family, at least, no surprise to anyone who's watched the show for a while, I'm a theater kid. So I was big on musicals. One of my first movies that I fell in love with was The Sound of Music, or apparently, as I insisted, it was called The Sound of Mucus. I don't know why. I was a big fan of just changing words and making things up. I thought wallpaper should have been called wallet paper. I was insistent about that for a few years. So, Aaron, no surprise, I've had a strong personality since the crib. But I think when we talked about this before, you mentioned that one of your favorite movies as a kid might have been in a little bit of a different age category. Tell us what yours was.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about it. And it's not only that, it was the first movie I went to see at the cinema was scary. That was Star Wars, and it terrified me. And I must have got hooked on fear because my favorite movie was highly inappropriate for a 10-year-old. It was The American Wolf in London. It was kind of scary. It was funny. It had inappropriate adult content, but we were all mesmerized by it. And I think my friends and I, 50 years on, still talk about this.
I mean, that's one of those timeless movies, right? That hopefully they never remake, because I personally love the practical effects. And if I have to watch one more movie that is overproduced with CGI, I'm just going to turn to different media, maybe go back to analog books. I was also a big horror fan. My mom and I were big scary movie fans, big ghost story fans. And I made the very unfortunate decision to sneak a copy of The Exorcist when I was probably 10 or 11. And right around the stair scene, I think that was when I about lost my mind and ran upstairs and hugged my mom and apologized for sneaking that movie in. So we would love to hear from you guys in the chat on any of the platforms you're tuning in from, what your favorite childhood movie was. We're getting a lot of Star Wars comments as well. Star Wars was probably one of the first movies I watched. My name is Leah. I don't know how I could get away from that. So let us know in the chat, and hopefully we keep hearing from you guys, and we'll pepper in any of those fun ones that we see throughout today's show. But speaking of maturity, let's talk a bit about our data resilience maturity model. If you guys didn't have a chance to check out any of our Veeam content from the last couple of months, one of the things that we debuted is this brand new maturity model. And you can see, as I said at the top of the show, this is all about reporting the news. This maturity model is not some super academic, futuristic, oh, let's push the category forward approach. We really wanted to take a balanced and measured approach. And that started with a set of hypotheses. So what makes up data resilience? Now, here at Veeam, you guys have heard us talk about the pillars before: backup, recovery, data portability, security, and intelligence. And that felt like a pretty good framing device as well for our initial set of hypotheses, and that ended up proving positive. We also thought it was really important to provide more business context for why those technical capabilities matter. So if you all have ever looked at any kind of framework device in the tech industry, you'll have also seen similar pillars around people and process and data strategy. Now, these are just kind of high concept ideas. What's really cool about the model is that you could actually ask probably 500 questions that fall into all of these different categories. But what we really did is took a look at what the most impactful best practices were that ultimately indicated a resilient organization. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and just say, I could keep going on and rambling and vamping, but I'd actually really love to cut over to a clip from Veeam. Our very own CEO, Anand Eshwaran, talked a lot about data resilience maturity model and why he thought it was so important to bring to market. So production, let's go ahead and roll that clip.
So what did we do with these insights? From studying and surveying hundreds of these customers and companies, we turned it into something actionable for every company to build their own path to resilience. And that is the data resilience maturity model, or we call it DRMM for short. DRMM is a blueprint. It's a structured path from how do you get to the basics to strategic resilience. It's a roadmap across people, process, and technology. Now, what I'm going to do is walk you through the 4 stages where you go from basic to best in class. Stage 1 is where many start, and let's be honest, it's bare minimum. Backups are manual, workloads are protected inconsistently with scattered point solutions. Your resilience strategy is very unclear. Your recovery plans exist in theory, never simulated, not in practice. Security is reactive. Accountability doesn't exist. This isn't strategic readiness. It's actually you're in survival mode, and it is not sustainable.
Awesome. Well, I think Anand teed that up perfectly. You could see that underneath the bones of what could be a pretty simplistic view of data resilience, we're really thinking about what the most crisp, articulate set of best practices are to measure. And he highlighted the fact that largely organizations around the world have a lot of risk exposure. And that's because one of the ways that we put this maturity model together was taking a look at actual organizations. So we've run this already through 500 organizations from around the world. And we'll talk a bit more about how we got there in just a minute. But to really quantify that, then we took a look at who the most mature were within that model. And we found that 74% of organizations fall into that Horizon 1, Horizon 2, or basic, maybe intermediate, a little bit reliable, but super limited on what you can do and whether or not you're confident that you can accomplish the outcomes your organization needs you to do. Aaron, I know when we've talked about this model before, these are a set of numbers that we've been really diving into. And throughout today's show, we're going to show different slices and dices of that first 500 data set. But why don't you talk a bit about kind of some of those other maturity layers and what some of the characteristics are that we look for?
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I mean, this one's kind of interesting because it kind of looks like 74% is a big number to be in 1 and 2. But I would say that, in that intermediate level, if you're quite mature within that band, you're probably doing everything you need to do to meet regulatory requirements, but there's still a huge upside in terms of further reducing risk and benefit to your organization. And it's kind of one of those things you have to look at some of the results and then stand back from the results to gather that picture as to what it takes to get someone into mature and adaptive and self-optimizing. And I think what it is that these organizations have built in a feedback loop and a continual drive to mature and improve. So they may be doing the same practices, but they know why they're doing them, and they're iterating on them and making them better and better each time, and therefore their outcomes are kind of shown in that. And a lot of times it boils down to they're very aligned to the business. The departments work together. They're highly aware of which are the most critical systems, and they've aligned their policies to match, as opposed to, well, here's the standard policy the organization signed up to, and everybody gets the same, the same outcome.
And, one of the things that we talked about on a show a couple of months ago is that regulatory compliance requirements continue to mature and change, especially as we look at different localized markets and different verticals. So just because you maybe passed an audit 2 years ago doesn't mean you're really ready for what your industry may be getting hit with in the months and even years ahead. So something that Aaron kind of highlighted that I want to put a finer point on is you may think you're good at X, but why? So a lot of what's really cool about models like this is that you can look at those dimensions of maturity, like we were showing on the slide before, and actually get quantified measurements of where your maturity is per dimension. So for example, you may find that your organization has pretty excellent backup. If you're in the Veeam community, hopefully that's the case. But you may find that across your organization, you're lacking in some other areas. Maybe you don't have some of the basic reporting capabilities in place that would help you automate some of these processes, stay ahead of whether or not you've achieved your leading indicators of success, for example. You may also find that your people and process is quite broken. We preach all the time on this show, and certainly in my last show, we talked about this with our own governance, risk, and compliance VP, that people and process is where a lot of the breakdown tends to happen. Are you sitting down and having meaningful conversations between IT operations teams and security operations teams? We find that that's not the case oftentimes, that everybody stays in their silos. So these are all different mechanisms that you can really improve with step-up improvements to reach different levels of maturity depending on your risk exposure. So we're actually going to do something really cool. I keep teasing the fact that you can measure things per dimension. Normally on the show, I spend some time drafting some poll questions to just keep the conversation going with you all in the community. But we have a very special treat today. What Aaron and I wanted to do is we actually wanted to give you guys a sneak preview of some of the questions that land in our data resilience maturity assessment. And in fact, the Veeam team is going to be publishing a short pulse check version of this assessment in the months ahead. So stay tuned to our socials, stay tuned to Veeam.com, because this is a tool that you should be able to take yourself and bring back to your organization. So let's get into that poll question. First, I think we should start with something that's super interesting, which is really looking at some of those future elements. If you go back and watch the keynote from Anand at VeeamON, he layered in a lot of not only some of the things that Veeam is really known for into each of their horizons, but he also took a look at the future. Where is this category going? So one of those questions that we think really we should be focusing on is about AI use cases. So in the chat, from whatever platform you're tuning in from, let us know which advanced analytics or AI use cases are in place for backup and recovery at your organization. You can go ahead and drop in a letter. You can go ahead and type an answer out, whatever makes sense for you. But we would really love to hear from you all how any of these best practices may be in play. And it's funny to say best practices about something that is quite cutting edge, but I think that really speaks to the speed of resilience and the speed of a lot of the threats that we're facing today. Aaron, do you want to talk a bit about why focusing on data intelligence is probably a really good idea early on in your assessment?
Yeah, I think I love the model goes into a number of areas, and there's quite a lot going on really, and we all know about AI, and AI is really there to kind of improve and reduce mistakes on practices that people have already identified. So in the data, it tells us that financial organizations that are pretty good in a lot of cases at this stuff tend to have had very mature practices to monitor, to react, to look at the detail of what's going on. And maybe other companies like technology companies might be using AI, so there's kind of differences between industry, but the same outcomes can be achieved. But I think we all realize we're going to be in a world where AI is going to kind of help us, and so it's, you mentioned reporting on the last one that I remember from many years ago was an organization happily monitored 99%. That was their metric, 99% success, 99%, but no one bothered to look. It was the same 1% that was failing, and that was a critical system. It seems obvious, but is it, right? And whereas an AI assistant might give you, hey, this is a critical system and it's had consecutive failures, therefore you're not going to meet your recovery point objective, and that's a business metric. How much effectively means how much data you would lose in the event of having to rely on recovery. So that's one thing. And the other thing is really resilience is more than just the practice of backup and recovery. It's security and how much you can reduce the impact and puts you in a much better position, and it's going to cost you less money to recover from it. So there's a whole bunch of things that you can get more proactive on using technology to assist with.
Awesome. Yeah. And there's definitely so many of those use cases. And I know someone mentioned on LinkedIn that they use the AI assistant within their backup solution. So super excited to hear that you all are already starting to adopt some of these technologies. Let us know in the chat, where you think AI might be going and where some of these use cases are for backup, recovery, security, any of those other dimensions. And we're having a lot of fun in the chat. I know production let me know that there are folks tuning in from and chatting from California, Canada, all the way over in Malaysia. I don't even know what time it is in Malaysia, Slovakia, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. I know that we also had one of our longtime viewers, Patrick, mention that he loves The Wizard of Oz. That was also one of my mom's favorite movies growing up, but she also mentioned that it was quite scary. She said she had nightmares about the flying monkeys, which nowadays I think, again, the practical effects of that are pretty funny, but for back then I can imagine was quite scary. So keep letting us know in the chat where you think AI and other kinds of analytics and automation will push our category forward. But let's go ahead and take that step back. Let's go ahead and take that measured approach. We wanted to kind of explain how we got here with this maturity model. We've peppered in some of what we did, but let's really put some framing around it. The first thing we did is we started with a set of hypotheses, as I said, and those hypotheses were formulated based on interviews from across the industry. So we interviewed about 25 different CIO and CISO roles. We interviewed a bunch of our alliance partners, which you can see multiple tech partners down there at the bottom. They contributed early on, especially as a way to get a much more holistic view than anything that one vendor like Veeam could do. And really, one of the things that was most important about putting this together was our partnership with McKinsey and Company. So McKinsey, of course, is a leader in the consulting space. Maturity models are their bread and butter. And this approach is tried and true. Starting with a set of hypotheses from industry experts is really key. Another industry expert that we worked with is Dr. George Westerman from MIT. And I had the great privilege of meeting with George at Veeam this year. We had a great conversation that will pop up in a webinar, I think in another month or two. So keep an eye out for that. Had another great conversation about AI on that one. But Dr. George Westerman has a ton of industry experience. He's actually the founder of the term digital transformation. So you can thank him or blame him, however you want to frame that for that one. But he really helped us put a lot of these best practices together. And then McKinsey went out and surveyed 500 organizations, really looking at that altitude. Who can see the total picture of their organization? And we surveyed them a ton of questions. I think it was about 125 questions across a bunch of different intervals, whether that be confidence interval questions, outcome-driven questions, so retrospectives, but then also looking at those hypothesis best practices. And from there, taking a data-driven approach, an objective, non-vendor approach, we were able to whittle that down to an assessment that we think will really give an organization the best picture they can get around the structure of their best practices, their risk exposure. That way they can have those conversations about where their risk appetite is, where they can make some of those improvements. And part of that comes down to, again, doing this with some of our industry partners, because I keep mentioning this concept of vendor agnostic. That was so important to us. We see a lot of vendors in the space launch some kind of maturity model that frankly is completely self-serving for their portfolio of products. And Veeam has always been all in on alliance partners and really considering ourselves as just a part of the overall picture. So to make that point, I wanted to go ahead and play a clip from a fabulous interview that I had the privilege of doing a few weeks ago with Demetrius Marlborough. Him and I have been friends on LinkedIn for years because we both have a ton of BCDR experience. And he is at Microsoft. For those who have tuned in before, I am ex-Microsoft as well. And he really gave us a good kind of overview of why he is so excited about the data resilience maturity model and why Microsoft is excited to partner with us on this model. So production, let's go ahead and roll that clip.
Yeah, so with my 20 plus years of experience in the backup and recovery industry, a lot of things have actually changed. And so what I've noticed is that the importance of moving workloads from on-prem to the cloud, they've been really critical, especially now with cybersecurity and cyber attacks, cyber threats. You're seeing things like extortion. And so you want to make sure that your organization has all of the proper capabilities in place, and that you're number one, you're doing your assessments. Number two, you're also doing your business impact analysis, because I don't see that very often. And so something like a data resilience maturity model is very important, especially all the way from your lower level backup administrators all the way up to the CEO, CIO, or even the Chief Information Security Officer board level. And so the importance of really making sure that all of your capabilities, all of your features, everything that you're utilizing from an infrastructure perspective are, number one, your recovery time objectives, your recovery point objectives, knowing exactly what they are and having those meetings so the people, the technology, all of that comes together in order to make sure that you're randomly and that you're not randomly having these conversations, and you are preparing, you're testing for when times may not be quite right. So let's say a cyber attack happens, or maybe an accidental deletion. You want to make sure that there's not that much stress involved because you are prepared. You have immutable storage. You're able to make sure that the bad guys are not deleting your data because you've already taken the proper steps to make sure that those capabilities were all in place. And that's exactly what the data resilience maturity model is all about. It's doing all the preparation, all the work up front, sitting down with all of your teams, making sure that data is redundant, not just locally, but across the globe. All of your data centers, regardless of where your data resides, so that you can make sure that you're passing your audits, you are in compliance, and you are also able to recover when you absolutely need it the most.
Awesome. So hopefully you all really enjoyed that interview with Demetrius. And if you want to hear more from Demetrius, he's actually been hosting a podcast for a long time called Data Protection Gumbo. And it's a really great vendor agnostic, again, approach to the market, because I think more and more we're going to be seeing a lot of these kinds of partnerships becoming super important. There is no silver bullet, right? We used to be orged in the backup side just to storage, right? I remember back in the day doing a lot of work with our channel partners, and our approach was, do you want fries with that? You're buying storage, Do you want to go ahead and throw in backup software? And now everything has really changed. A lot of the use cases have pushed us to be thinking more as an ecosystem and working together. So hopefully that gave you guys a good picture of why Microsoft thought it was so important to work with us. And again, continue to talk with experts in the field. And a lot of what I think, Demetrius highlighted on, and then Aaron certainly in his whole career has been preaching, is focusing on outcomes, because you can get really stuck in the weeds with speeds and feeds, but it all comes down to those business objectives and taking a reality check to those business objectives. Can you actually do the things that you are committing to doing from an SLA perspective, from a fiscal responsibility perspective? Did you, past tense, actually achieve those things? So on the screen here, we have kind of a nice contrast view, because there's always going to be leading indicators of success. And these are actually some of the things that we ask about in the assessment. But ultimately, it boils down to whether or not an organization can or has achieved the objectives, the lagging indicators of success. So Aaron, do you want to talk a bit about why that became a focus within the DRMM?
Yeah, well, it was the only way, I think, Leah, to really objectively measure which of the practices deliver the outcome. And I love it because on my LinkedIn profile, I think I say the wise man loves to be corrected by data science. And, a lot of the time data science confirms something you already know, but it's those little bits of differences. Now, I've been doing backup and recovery for customers since 1996, so I could probably have a good go at writing my own maturity model. I'd probably get 80% of the things in there, but would I really know the real secret sauce that gives you that little bit of a difference? So the ambition we've put into the DRMM to work back from these outcomes using machine learning techniques like clustering and different forms of ranking to really work out which things make a difference, and then with qualitative information understand how that was implemented differently at these organizations in level 4 and level 3. That really gives you the confidence that were you to put an investment to try and move from say 2 to 3, then you would likely get the same improvements in mean time to recovery time, and recovery point objective that the others enjoyed. It would also give you some focus for the business case that's highly defensible, because if I'm improving recovery time, recovery point, I'm reducing cost for an outage, and that's a business metric that people will care about and they will care to fix. So, I think it's a critical factor. No one's going to just want to move from 2 to 3 unless there's a real measurable business outcome. And I love the way we reverse engineered. We went from outcomes to practices, and we used data to tell us what the significant differences were. And that's critically it. This is the difference in this model than others. Others tend to be focused on what I have to sell in my price book, and if you move from the basic to the advanced, you're going to have a better outcome. Well, this is saying, well, it's not just about what Veeam have on the price book; it's all the other adjacent practices. Like Ghani on the LinkedIn said, AI boosts security with faster threat detection and response. Well, with DRMM, we dig into why you need to be integrated across your security teams, your backup teams, your automation teams, and your data management and governance teams. And that's how you get the best outcomes.
It definitely is. And these kinds of outcomes also play into so much of what your organizations or your customers' organizations are delivering to market. So whether that be, a focus on shareholder value, fiduciary responsibility, and cost per outage, whether that be looking at things like SLAs for RTOs and RPOs within your organization and business units, again, stack ranking some of the most critical, but then also taking a look at your customer's experience and, ultimately looking at brand impact. I know we've seen some of these, national newsmaking and international newsmaking outages and cyber attacks, and it becomes a really long road to recovery in terms of building constituent confidence. I know Aaron and I were together last week in Seattle working on some of the maturity model elements, and all of us were buzzing at the dinner table talking about a recent cyber attack right here in my home state in Ohio that had completely decimated a massive healthcare system. And in fact, it was right around the street from where NATO has been meeting in Dayton, Ohio. So there was a lot of buzz around whether or not that was correlative. And it just goes to show that you can really start from some of those big, scary, FUD driving news stories, but then work backwards in a much more confident approach from these lagging indicators of success that do indicate business outcomes, all the way through some of those leading indicators of success. So I'm sure you can tell, are super proud of this model, and we can't wait to get more feedback from you all in our community. Speaking of that feedback, let's go ahead and throw up another poll question. Again, these are teasers of questions that are going to be in the assessment, and specifically, we will be publishing a short pulse check version of the assessment for anyone in our community to take in the months ahead. So stay tuned to socials, stay tuned to Veeam.com. So one of those questions in that pulse check is, which of the following most accurately represents your organization's ability to meet RTOs and RPOs for critical workloads? Is it formal at all? Maybe a little bit defined? Are they defined but not at all tested and tracked, and therefore you have absolutely no confidence that you can hit them? Are they defined and you can meet them on the best of days? Or are they really battle tested for the worst of days? Can they hit that sort of chaos theory approach? Let us know in the chat where you think your organization falls, especially if you have any kind of insights on why conversations like this are so important to have across your organization, because we know from the backup community that oftentimes this question sits with one person. And nowadays, this question needs to sit with a lot more than one person. This really does take a sort of center of excellence approach to get a measured, accurate, confident picture of your SLAs. Aaron, do you want to chat a bit about, why this is something that probably in every conversation you talk about?
Yeah, and I've known these terms, as I say, for nearly 30 years, and I think why is it different in some organizations and others? Maybe they've got the same technology, but they have different outcomes. And I think it is a lack of focus on the outcome in line with what the business expects. In fact, one of our other surveys we used to riff on a lot was the data protection survey, and it always highlighted that the IT were aware of a huge gap between what the business expects and what will be delivered in reality. So that would mean more data would be lost in the event of recovery, and it would take longer than expected. I think that, the difference here is, when we really dig into that and we have open conversations, and the DRMM may be a way of safely having that conversation, gather people above the, higher up in the organization and at the VP level in different organizations with a different view, and engage their view of where they are, but then come in with a consultative workshop as we do to dig into those results and ask those questions. There's huge power in getting people together in an open and in a safe environment where we can really discuss how we're meeting business requirements, and then it will highlight where the challenges are, and then it's then designing how we're going to implement the technology against these RPO and RTOs. They're not just giveaway words; they're really serious. Does the business want to have the data up to seconds, or is it okay with 24 hours? Well, did you differentiate between the ones that create the most revenue and are the most disrupted in an outage? Or did you treat everything the same based on maybe governance and compliance requirements and not business requirements? So it's really, that's why it's critical. I even mentioned in the AI earlier, the AI tells you the 1% is the same system that's critical failing again and again. And our AI system does tell you that. But if you're just looking at reports without interpreting them, you could make that same mistake. So, that's why I think these are critical, and all projects should have defined business goals measured by some technical metric, to define every project. Otherwise, how are you going to know it's going to be successful?
And that word "you" is one that I want to kind of turn on as well, because you, person who uses Veeam often, may know for your specific purview, but does the team, does the organization, especially does leadership know? And that was actually a hypothesis we wanted to test. So in that first 500 data set, one of the questions we asked right at the start was, where do you think you're going to fall? Where do you think you're going to fall overall? Where do you think you're going to fall per dimension? And boy, was it different. than where they actually ended up landing. 1/3 of the survey respondents believed that they were more resilient than the maturity model ended up proving. So that is super interesting. And when we also ask that same question across some of the dimensions, especially the most critical ones, backup, recovery, security, it was even bigger of a gap, which you wouldn't expect. You would think that those would be the ones you would know the most because that's what we spend our time talking about. But these kinds of VP and above roles don't necessarily have the best picture. And so this can be one of those agitating, eye-opening, wow, we've got risk exposure here moments. So especially for you all in the community, if you want to advocate within your organization for making data resilience more of a priority, this is the perfect set of stats to put in front of leadership. Because if they have such a big gap in their understanding, imagine how big of a gap they have in whether or not they can actually achieve those outcomes for the business, just as Aaron was mentioning. And I know we've been getting some really good chatter in the comments. Christopher on LinkedIn mentioned a lot of organizations, especially the larger organizations, often fall in that kind of number B category. So I have my RPOs and RTOs defined, but I have no real confidence that I can hit them. And that's especially due, as Christopher said in the chat, to siloed architectures. There's a big difference between what headquarters thinks and what the field thinks. And those are all hypotheses that we also saw proven positive in the model. Aaron, do you want to add anything on this confidence interval talk track?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think. I mean, we could argue over the word confidence. I think they're doing a good job in these 2/3, but they're just not aware of, where focus on best practice and maturing that best practice can take them. And I think that's why we've designed some of our services that follow on from DRMM to kind of force an alignment between, the backup infrastructure and security teams, because that speed and accuracy of information in order to react more quickly usually gives you a better outcome, right? Because you've acted more quickly. If I had a plan and everybody knew what authority I had to make a decision, how quickly I could respond, who I needed to inform, and there was no time lags or delays built into that, then I'm going to have a better outcome. So it's just helping guide them to just take those practices to the next level in order to get the better outcomes.
That's absolutely right. I think that's key. I was a little distracted as Aaron was talking because production was letting me know that Christopher shares my last name. Shout out to my baby brother, Christopher. He works at Deloitte. Thank you for tuning in. He specifically works at DoD customers, so it's not like he's just a random. He does actually work in IT. We all followed the family business. My dad retired last year from a long career at IBM. He's probably tuning in as well. We like to keep it in the family here at Veeam. But speaking of DoD, let's maybe talk a bit about verticals, because that was another really important thing that the Veeam team and especially the McKinsey team wanted to really impress upon us, that so much of this isn't just about a broad stroke approach to, oh, you have risk here, you should totally do something about it. It really needs to come down to taking a look at what kind of risk appetite your organization has. And what we found in analyzing that first 500 data set is that a lot of the highly regulated industries are more mature. And we think from the interviews and in kind of doing some of the follow-up with those respondents, that it comes down to the pressure that regulatory compliance puts on an organization. The converse of that, though, is that these organizations that aren't in necessarily regulated industries or super regulated countries and markets, they maybe aren't prioritizing this kind of risk at the same level that other industries are. So as an example, you might take a look at a high growth company within energy and utilities or technology and media and find that they may have, plenty of money because they're in a revenue growth model, but that's not trickling down into spend on IT operations and security. And I want to talk about spend a bit in just a second, but Aaron, I know this is where you've been spending a lot of your time as well, is really looking at some of these data insights. And we're looking forward to having more respondents too, to keep this data hydrated. Certainly some of these cuts are a little thin on statistical defensibility. So, bear with us as we keep building out this data set. But Aaron, any kind of interesting insights you want to build out here?
I think I mentioned one earlier that, if you look at the two leading industries there, the technology, media, and communications, or telecommunications, and finance, there is some devil in the detail there, whereas one will use more technology and one will use more rigor in process. But that means the good news is there's more improvement for both those organizations if they adopt the best practices of each other, right? So there's things to learn all the way through. But having said that, I've worked predominantly in finance all my life. It's where I've probably acquired some of the best practices from what customers do. But I know that a lot of organizations don't score in there in the highest level, but there's a huge potential there, and a huge potential value to those organizations in disruption. And I think that's the lesson across the piece. And it's arguably, I'd say probably 75 to 80%, not arguably, it's data. I know what the data says. I don't know why. 75% plus of organizations that are getting the best outcomes are in what you would call the enterprise segment, probably because of the increased impact and threat to business. But some of the top performers are not in that. Maybe they're newer companies that, develop practices from day zero. I think all it really tells me is a huge room for improvement in every organization. Every organization can learn those 1 or 2 or 10 nuggets of information and practices that they can become aware of, and they can help guide their business forward. I think it could be really good for someone's career in their organization to help, garner support for running through a DRMM survey and read back and really assess where they are and, get into one of these nice blue and green bands on this chart.
And I think we'll give you all at the end of the show an idea of how you can really, if you want to be that sort of center of excellence champion, bring an idea up within your organization. So stay tuned for the end of the show for that. And I know we're running a little bit long, but hopefully you guys can see we are super excited and passionate about this. So especially because I really want to get to another clip from one of our partners on this model to tee that up. I want to go back to something I mentioned before around some of the differences in the verticals, and it comes down to spend and cost. One of the things we heard in the interviews, and we've also proven positive in talking with our various analyst partners, is that cost oftentimes becomes one of the biggest barriers in investing time, headcount, spend on data resilience initiatives. Obviously, we're really excited to keep seeing the importance of data resilience move up and up, coming out of the basement, as we say, and moving into a boardroom priority. But I think cost is also gaining significant ground, certainly due to market volatility and other factors that we're seeing. But that doesn't mean that you can't prioritize it within your organization. At Microsoft, one of the things we said a lot was do more with less, which I don't love hearing from someone that I'm going and asking money for, but it is kind of the fact of the markets that we're in today. So what I wanted to do is show you all a clip from a really great conversation I had with Mikhail Goldstein from Palo Alto Networks. She has a ton of industry experience across the security space. And right now she is the director for security architecture and research at Palo Alto. And she's been one of our partners from the very beginning on the data resilience maturity model. I had a chance to catch up with her and have a really fun conversation. We're going to drop one of those clips after the show as well. So stay tuned to our YouTube for some of these little short videos that we do. But for this show specifically, I wanted to talk a bit about how you can use more of the technology that you already bought and identify those priorities through the maturity model. So let's take a look at that interview.
So rapid response becomes crucially important. We're seeing that data exfiltration is dropping from 1 week that you used to take attackers to less than a day. And if you compare that to the average of 6 days it takes security teams to handle an incident, that becomes quite clear how much we need for automation. So to my previous point, automation could be useful actually across all 3 pillars: technology, people, and processes. And thanks to integrations and the tool set that you have from all the products that you've implemented and worked hard to properly deploy, you need to leverage those integrations so that you have the visibility across all your teams, across all your tools. And also you have the option to respond and investigate automatically as soon as an incident is detected. So from the detection steps throughout the investigation and the automated remediation and response, automation is your key to be able to keep up with the speed and complexity of attacks and allow your teams to already work on being much more proactive rather than responding and trying to figure things out after the fact. Use your integrations, use the technology stack that you already have in a much better way.
Awesome. So that, again, was a great conversation, and stay tuned to our YouTube in the weeks ahead for another really great conversation that Mikhail and I had. But specifically, I think it tees up the ever-present point that is always a through point in anything we talk about on the show, which is how important the changing threat landscape has become on why backup and recovery and reporting and the basics that we know and love in IT operations land are more important than ever and becoming that board level priority. So again, we want to highlight a question that's in our assessment. Which of the following most accurately describes your organization's ransomware response plan? Is there a plan at all? Is there a really outdated plan and no one's really been trained on it? You've had a bunch of staff changeover. Is the plan ready, but training is inconsistent? Or do you have a fully tested plan and you run those regular exercises? And if you don't know the answers to that question, that's probably a good sign, especially if you're in an IT operations role that specializes in backup, that there is something wrong on the people and process side. So these are the kinds of agitating questions that seem pretty basic, but they're really important when given greater context. Aaron, I know, one of the things that we did a lot last year was run a lot of roundtables and workshops with VP and above roles in the field, especially in the Americas. And cyber was one of our focus areas, especially when we roadshowed with the Cover team from Veeam. You want to talk a bit about why this is becoming so important?
Yeah, I mean, most organizations should, value the doing this kind of practice, an incident response tabletop, if you will. So we've done them, one to many different organizations, and that kind of introduces the subject. We create pressure points. Sometimes the use cases we use might be familiar, might be something they've been through before. Ultimately, when you get to something that's tailored and more personal, and we offer that, some of our services, tailored incident response tabletops, when we know about the organization, it really tests the pressure points, the decision pressure points. Who has got the right to shut down production in a factory if you're in manufacturing because we think there's a high risk to a network device that's got a known vulnerability on it? Well, if you don't know who to talk to and it takes you a day and a half to get that might be too late. And you may have caused more outage by delaying that decision. So there's a huge amount of value in bringing an organization together and going through that. And it creates more questions. And the organization has the knowledge often. It just needs a way to reveal it to itself. And so the consultative exercise really helps that.
It really can. And, certainly, especially given the rapid pace of changes, it's so important. Obviously, our last show on Industry Insights was all about our ransomware trends report, talking about what's going on in the landscape today. One of the things that we were talking about at the dinner table last week with that recent cyber attack was whether or not it was a lone wolf or one of our well-known threat organizations. And it sounds like it's the latter, but a lot of what we talked about in this report is that something that's changing is these lone wolf attacks. And when you have those kinds of attacks, it becomes even more unpredictable and therefore makes these kinds of best practices even more important. I guess I should point this way, not this way, one of those fun mirroring effects. So speaking of best practices, Demetrius in his interview from Microsoft talked a bit about business impact analysis. So we wanted to wrap the show today with one of the best practices within the model that we really focused on. We can talk all day long about the threat landscape, and obviously I have and can continue. But I think that bringing it back to confident, measurable best practices that pretty stay exactly as they are, right? It's reporting the news. We can be doing the same kind of business impact analysis today that we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Obviously, there's going to be some flavor of ice cream changes within that. But Aaron, talk a bit about why business impact analysis became something within the model that we actually asked several questions about, because it seems like from the data, this can be one of those key indicators of whether or not an organization is ready for anything.
Okay, will do. So I'm going to mention your brother from Deloitte on here, right? So one of my reference materials I have used from that organization are, top down business decisions and bottom up decision making. And a top down decision, it can't really tell you where you want to go unless you know where you already are. And business impact analysis is one way of revealing that. And when we do the tabletops, sometimes people hold up their hands and go, "Oh no, we don't have any of this. It's a nightmare. Yes, we need to do it. How do I get funding for a project to improve and make all this happen? Because we know we have a problem now. We accept it." And then other people from other organizations will offer business impact analysis, because if you don't know what the potential impact is, you don't know what the priority systems are, you don't know the size of that measure, then how can you set a business goal that, say, is reduce the cost of an outage by 80%? But because I don't know how much it would cost today, I can't measure that, right? So it's a real critical part of all the knowledge you need to gather in order to move. You look at all the practices that you can improve upon that maybe you're not doing, but also look at those impacts that you're probably having, measure where they really are, and then you can measure the benefit of moving across the maturity model and getting these better outcomes because you've done those impact analysis and you do know what it would cost your organization should you suffer from a prolonged outage.
And I think that kind of puts the best, finest point on this, which is that it comes down to bringing the organization together, agitating the room, asking these kinds of questions. And a lot of the times that can magically prioritize what an organization does, whether that's time, money, resources, outsourcing, etc. So this feels like a really good place to wrap at. We're going to go ahead and just flip over to some things that we can leave you with, because a lot of what we want to impress upon you all in the community is that you can take this talk track back to your organization and make this a focus. So to do that, we've got a couple of great resources. The first is we've published an outline and taking a look further at our data resilience maturity model in this ebook. So this is available today on Veeam.com. It's a really great resource to go ahead and socialize around. We also are going to post in the chat, our production team is going to post a really great article that we worked on the Wall Street Journal with. So Anand Ashwaran, our CEO, had a chance to catch up with the Wall Street Journal and talk about why this is becoming such a critical priority for organizations. So if you need that sort of letter to the boss, that Wall Street Journal article is going to be a great way to get some of that initial interest. We've had a great show here today, guys. The chats have been amazing. I was catching up with production on whether or not we were having some people fall asleep, because this is probably our longest show to date, and it sounds like we've only gained audience throughout. So if you guys are catching the recording, please join us on a live stream. It's really fun in the chat. We haven't planned what our next topic is yet, because our lives have been so focused on the data resilience maturity model. But I think we have some really good ideas brewing for our June show. So keep an eye out on our socials. Go ahead and subscribe to that event when it gets added in the next few weeks. Once again, I'm your host, Leah Troscianecki. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us on today's show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah.
Awesome. And we will catch you all on the next show.